Welcome back. You're still tuned in to News and Views with myself, Salalo Makudiri, and we're going to be switching gears now to the biggest headline of the past week, South Africa's relationship with Israel, which has essentially entered an almost sharp and highly charged diplomatic phase. This is after Pretoria declared Israel's senior envoy persona non grata, sending a clear message that diplomatic status does not amount to immunity from misconduct. Subsequently, the move comes against the backdrop of South Africa's genocide case against Israel at the ICJ, and it has also triggered retaliatory action from Tel Aviv. This is quite interesting because it raises wider questions about international law, about sovereignty and South Africa's foreign policy posture, especially on Palestine. And to help us unpack the legal, diplomatic and geopolitical implications of this moment, we are joined now by Professor Garth le Pere, an international relations expert and respected voice in global diplomacy. Prof, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to News and Views. I really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
No, the pleasure's all ours, and I think we can jump right into it. From your vantage point, your analysis of the past week, where we saw people being classified as persona non grata, a diplomatic fallout between Israel and South Africa, with the element of the United States being in the mix, seeing how they've been giving South Africa the cold shoulder in the last few months under this new Donald Trump tenure. What do you make of it? What do you make of South Africa's diplomatic relations with Israel and the implications that this recent charged d'affaires being classified as persona non grata?
Well, I think it's very important, to lay the legal premise for this expulsion, because it takes place in the context of Article 9 of the 1961 Vienna Convention that empowers the receiving state to expel a diplomat without explanation, thereby terminating their diplomatic immunity and privileges and declaring them persona non grata, which means an unwelcome person. However, in this case, South Africa does provide sufficient justification and a rationale for this expulsion on the basis of three considerations, which are in the public domain. The first is the critical remarks this charge d'affaires, Ariel Seidman, made about the President of the Republic, Cyril Ramaphosa, in a podcast. And that was preceded, by the way, by notification by the Department of International Relations and Cooperation to Ariel Seidman that those kinds of remarks are unacceptable. And they are quite insulting, disparaging, and pejorative. And that should stop. Nevertheless, the charge d'affaires continued making those insulting remarks. That's the first consideration. The second is that there are senior Israeli officials that visited our country without notifying the relevant officials in government of the nature and purpose of their visits, and that is required by virtue of diplomatic protocol. Those visits were not notified, and that is the second consideration. The third consideration is that Israel has developed very close relations with the Amatembu king Dalian Yebo. He went to Israel, the king did, on an official visit in December last year. And on the basis of this relationship, the Israeli government then offered water treatment equipment to the king's community in the Eastern Cape without informing or without coordination of the provincial government or the national government. And I think that the response by the Premier of the Eastern Cape was quite justified. Oscar Mabuyeni is on record as saying that this was a manifest violation of the sovereignty of his government as well as the sovereignty of the South African government. So those three considerations are very material in this decision to expel the charge d'affaires, justifiable in my view. And then, as you note in your introduction, there was the reciprocal vengeful reaction by the Israeli government and its foreign ministry to expel our representative. And he was not even in Tel Aviv, by the way. Sean Edward Beinefeld is our ambassador to the state of Palestine, based in Ramallah. He was then given 72 hours to leave and return to South Africa as a reciprocal reaction by the state of Israel. So it is all, I think, a situation that has a larger context, which has to do with South Africa's very difficult and fractured relations with the state of Israel in the aftermath of our ICJ case against the state of Israel in terms of this 1948 Genocide Convention and Israel's genocidal assault in December 23. And that was even preceded, by the way, by South Africa's decision to withdraw ambassador to Israel in 2018, which had a lot to do with the creeping brutality of the state of Israel, the IDF, Israeli Defense Forces, against the citizens of Gaza, virtually turning it into an open prison. And then we know that Israel recalled its ambassador to South Africa in 2023 in the aftermath of our inception of our case at the ICJ. So that is the broad context of the issues.
Thank you so much for laying it out the way that you have. I've been hearing some, rebuttals essentially coming from Israel's point of view, their embassy, and some of their analysts and international relations experts. And they're essentially saying South Africa's actions are politically motivated and extremist. I heard that word being used a lot. How might this affect South Africa's relationships, not just with Israel, but with some Western powers, especially the United States of America, who I think have already shown criticism of South Africa's international relations policy and some of the stances that we have taken?
Well, you see, there are two considerations at stake here. One is a matter of principle, and the other is a matter of pragmatism. The principle to defend here is the protection and the defense of the sovereignty of this country, vis-a-vis a senior diplomat that had exceeded the boundaries of what is allowed in terms of diplomatic protocol and in terms of the conventional behavior of diplomats in the receiving country. The pragmatic consideration here is that South Africa is in the crosshairs of the United States. We are in the process of, having our status in the African Growth and Opportunity Act reviewed in the Congress. It has passed the House of Representatives. It is in the Senate, where there are Republican hawks that buy into Trump's discourse that South Africa is anathema to America's security interests by virtue of the fact that we, in the American discourse, we associate and we have alliances with America's enemies, namely China, Russia, Iran, and so on. And, the decision whether we will retain our privileges under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which are quite substantial, by the way, amounting to almost 40% of our trade exports to the United States, worth $3.74 billion a year, with great impacts on the automotive and agricultural sectors in this country as far as employment is concerned, that will come up for review. So, we sit on the horns of this dilemma vis-a-vis the principle of protecting our sovereignty against a diplomat that has exceeded the boundaries of diplomatic protocol, and on the other hand, protecting our privileged status in trade exports to the United States, which could have very adversarial effects for jobs as well as our export capacity globally, and especially to the US.
And I think a follow-up question to that would be: is there a way that South Africa can almost balance moral foreign policy imperatives, like speaking out against this genocide that we've been seeing in Gaza for the last 2-3 years now, with the necessity for diplomatic engagement and also economic interests, as you mentioned, AGOA, the United States of America, and just how much we've been benefiting from that policy?
Well, I think there are there may be a couple of things that we should take into consideration here as well. The one is that we do not have an ambassador on the ground in Washington, which sort of undermines the cases that we can make. Washington very much functions on the basis of connections and the ability to enter into dialogue with the lawmakers, both in the House and the Senate, and also, the power of persuasion that we have with people that ultimately will make the decisions, primarily in the trade sector and the officialdom within the Trump administration. And these are supposedly rational people. They use a rational calculus to look at what are the interests of the United States vis-a-vis this particular trading relationship. And those interests are quite substantial. The benefits that the US gets from South Africa are quite substantial, not only in terms of automotive exports and agricultural exports, but also in the basket of critical minerals and the natural resources. 60%, by the way, of our export basket that goes into the United States. Those are quite substantial, and they cannot be ignored in the calculus of decision that goes into how do we rebalance trade, especially in terms of the 30% tariff that Donald Trump has slapped on South Africa, which basically negates all the benefits that we get out of AGOA. So the moral of the story is really that South Africa has to seriously make a strategic decision on diversifying its export markets away from the United States, although we do have some kind of privileged access to the European Union in terms of what is called the TDCA, the Trade Development and Cooperation Agreement, even though that has substantial non-tariff barriers. But nevertheless, as a trading bloc, the European Union remains South Africa's largest trading partner. So we have, we have all these conundrums to deal with in terms of protecting our interests, and especially, the basic principles that underpin the tenets of our foreign policy. Those are very important, and they go back to 1994. They go back to, the liberation tradition that goes with how South Africa's foreign policy principles have evolved. And those are very important to protect as underpinnings of how South Africa projects its brand and image to the global community, but particularly in terms of the strategic kind of engagements that we have with our global partners. Now, that said, it becomes very important then for how South Africa then decides to, diversify its export markets away from this sort of trade dependencies. And it's really a path dependency on the European Union and the United States, which has, historical antecedents.
There've been some, voices, political voices, even from, people on the ground here in South Africa who are pushing for an even more drastic measure when it comes to Israel and South Africa relations. They are suggesting that South Africa should be shutting down the Israeli embassy altogether. What's your response to that, and what could be some of the potential diplomatic and legal implications of such an approach?
Well, you see, again, that conundrum comes into play. Principle and practice. Do we need to maintain an embassy and official relations with the state of Israel as a matter of principle? I'm on record as saying shut down the embassy, close down all official diplomatic relations with the state of Israel. That has implications there. It means that we close down all corridors or all avenues of dialogue with the state of Israel in the first instance. Equally important, we depend on the representation and the goodwill of the state of Israel to maintain our diplomatic representation in Ramallah. Remember that Israel is the occupying power in the West Bank and Gaza. And as the occupying power, they have the power and the authority to decide, who the diplomatic representatives will be in Ramallah. And as we have seen in the case of our representative, Sean Edward Beineveld, that was withdrawn in a very arbitrary way, and he has to come home in 72 hours, which means that we have absolutely no diplomatic presence either in the West Bank, and this has been downgraded in Tel Aviv itself. So these are very, very difficult diplomatic questions. My view is that we do have trading relations with the state of Israel, believe it or not. Israel is one of the largest consumers of South African coal. And that is quite a substantial source of export revenue in our total international global basket. Now, can we afford to withdraw that kind of benefit in favor of a principal position of shutting down all relations with the state of Israel? So these are sacrifices that you have to consider, in how we are going to balance our national interests vis-a-vis our economic interests. And it's not an easy one. I don't have a solution. I take a principle, philosophical, and normative position that the state of Israel harms our national interest, especially, in terms of the historic and contemporary support that we have given to the people of Palestine. And that is quite an important anchor of our foreign policy worth protecting, in my view.
Lastly, before I let you go, Prof, what would de-escalation almost look like at this stage, and who needs to move first? And when it comes to South Africa, are we almost repositioning ourselves as the moral middle power in international discourse? And if so, what are the long-term implications of that role? Are we playing it well also?
Well, I think that, in the broad context of the shifting landscape of geopolitics, characterized by turbulence, turmoil, greater disruption, South Africa really has to rethink its place on the global stage. It has to rethink that very, very strategically in terms of economic interests and in terms of our principal, what I would call interests as a norm entrepreneur. South Africa promotes certain norms in international relations, which is upholding the international system of cooperation centered on the United Nations, the multilateral system. We advance all sorts of cooperative initiatives in the global south. Our hosting of the G20 in November was a signal success in making a mark and really implanting South Africa's signature as a norm entrepreneur that promotes global cooperation and really addressing some serious problems, systemic problems that afflict all countries, but particularly those of the global south. And these are articulated, by the way, in the communique, official communique that came out of the summit of the G20. So South Africa is a force behind that agenda of South-South cooperation, improved North-South relations. So I think we need to basically rethink the strategic compass of where are we going amid this turbulence. So it's that strategic compass, if I may just be very brief, has to take into account certain strategic points of reference. The first is our African agenda. How do we develop closer trade, development, and diplomatic relations with the African continent in terms of the integration agenda? And here the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes very important as an impetus behind that. So it's an integration of the continent, advancing. And South Africa, by the way, is I think the last I checked, it's the 19th largest contributor to peace missions under the United Nations. So our peace agenda, our promoting the African peace and security architecture in Africa becomes very important. The second is the South-South dimension, right, which is where we play a very important part as a member of BRICS and BRICS Plus now, right? Promoting positive trade agendas, thinking about joint problem solving, collective action around issues of financing for development, climate, dealing with, how do we position technology to spur growth, poverty alleviation, the sustainable development goals, by the way, they come to a conclusion in 4 years' time. Is South Africa, advancing a sort of new template on how do we think about the post-SDG agenda with a particular focus on the global South? Then becomes, relations with the global North, particularly the United States, and then how do we repair our relations with the United States? We're not going to get the politics exactly right because the fractures and the friction there are too deep-seated, but there are manifest economic interests that are mutually binding around which we can continue. But the important thing is to make sure that we get a very, very good diplomat to represent us in Washington in that regard. Then, of course, there is the European Union that we can't ignore. And the European Union is going through its own existential crises, vis-a-vis the transatlantic relations with the United States. And then on the eastern side, there's the war of Ukraine, the future of NATO, etc., etc. So these are very, very difficult, complex, and imponderable issues that we have to bring onto our diplomatic radar screen and really rethink the entire architecture of our foreign policy vis-a-vis these problems. It can be done, and I think we have the intellectual capital, we have the diplomatic capital to do so.
There have it, Professor Garth le Pere. Thank you so much for chatting to us. Always a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Hey, have a good day.
There we go. Yeah, I think very, very interesting conversation there with Professor Garth le Pere, international relations expert, unpacking the complex diplomatic crisis between South Africa and Israel. And it's very, very important because this one stretches from breaches of protocol, especially from Israel's point of view, and then looking at the response, obviously, which is fueled by the battleground out at the ICJ by Israel, and it reverberates through global geopolitics. So it'll only be interesting to see where to from here. And a very, very important question that I asked the professor: what would de-escalation look like at this stage, at this point? Is there even room for de-escalation, and who would need to move first? Would it be South Africa to say, okay, we're seeing what's been happening in the last few years? Granted, there's an ICJ case, but maybe dialogue, as it has always been South Africa's nature, is the way to go about things. We're a country that still believes in multilateralism. Maybe that's what we should be going. That's the route, because I can tell you the expectation that Israel will be the first ones to reach out to South Africa, almost 0 to none. So yeah, it'll be interesting how DIRCO continues to handle this Israeli problem that we have on our hands, and what you South Africans want to see, because I think in a lot of ways also internal politics here in South Africa could largely influence our international relations policy. We have local government elections coming out. We saw how much of a feature, how much of a big feature was the Gaza genocide in the previous national general elections. So yeah, it would be interesting to see the balancing act the government of the day almost draws when it comes to dealing with this debacle. Otherwise, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be having Ward 73 councillor out in Benoni for our community desk feature to give us a bit more insight on some of the electricity challenges that they've been having in that part of the world. So more on that after this.